Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes. Let's rant with Scrapper on the Rebirth server with Psyop, our level 24. Closing in on level 25 character. We're with Amanda Lewis, and we're getting some artwork back from the Tsu, which might be a story arc. Not sure. So we're looking for the Art Thief, and we're going to King's Row, and we're going to just mission teleport because she's way the heck over here in um, Independence Port. I actually flew over here from Brickstown because I forgot you could do that. Duh. And as we go, we're going to do a Let's Rant, and I want to follow up on the last episode. In the previous episode, I talked about the shortage of DMs and how what that issue is and why it may be an issue and what's causing it, right? And the Questing Beast talked about this, and one of the reasons we said was that the article that complained about the shortage was talking about all the things DMs could do, and it sounds really hard. And maybe people would read this and go, "I can't do that," right? If this is what people think DMing is, well, no wonder there are shortages. But I also said that I think that the other reason, and you know what I need to do is turn this up to +1. But we'll do that when we get out of the mission. So another reason why people might not be DMing as much is that D&D can be frustrating from the perspective, and I talked about how it's basically that because there are so many more players, Wizards of the Coast is trying to please players, and they're doing this by giving the players all kinds of options that basically make the DM's job harder, more frustrating, and maybe not a lot of fun. And I want to sort of expand on this and talk about why it is, because after making that video, I watched something from the Basic Expert who talked about having too many options is not a good thing. And he was sort of saying what I said in an earlier video, that constraints are good, and they help you solidify your character rather than harming you. But I want to talk about it from the perspective of not so much the constraints on players, but how the lack of constraints on players can severely affect the dungeon master, the game master's experience. And perhaps by making the game more quote-unquote fun for players by expanding their horizons and allowing them to do anything they want, you're wrecking it for GMs. So I want to talk about sort of the different types of consequences of having all of these options available for players. So let's talk about what happens and why Magic the Gathering is part of why it happens, why Wizards of the Coast is doing this, because they're basically doing the same thing they did in Magic the Gathering, which, by the way, made me quit playing Magic the Gathering. Right? When Magic the Gathering first came out, Wizards of the Coast was a small company, and I mean, it started out as I think as a card game that people were doing themselves by photocopying cards in cardstock while they're in college at the University of Washington, and that's why the company was based in Seattle. And then over the years, it turned into a game that they sold to people, and it became a collectible game. Right? They want people to buy cards. They make the collectible cards. You buy more and more and more to get a better collection. And the better your collection is, the better a deck you can make, and the more you can win the competition. And that's kind of the logic of it. And what they started doing in Magic the Gathering was they realized that players want a competitive edge. So whenever they put out a new expansion set, they put in cards that were more powerful than the original cards in the default starter sets to make people feel like they needed those expansions and couldn't stick with just their starter set, because they would lose battles with their cards if they didn't have the buffed cards from the better expansions stuff, right? So in order to entice players to buy new product, Wizards learned the lesson of, if we put more powerful options in the expansions, people will buy them. This is sort of fundamental to the operating philosophy of Wizards of the Coast. It was highly successful in Magic, and it made them billions. And it made me quit, right? Because I saw what they were doing, and I saw that what they were doing was essentially making... These guys saw me? What they were doing was essentially making my existing decks, if not unplayable, seriously handicapped if I wasn't willing to continue investing in the new expansions and getting the newer cards. And of course, this was their profit motive, right? This is why they're doing it, because they're trying to sell the cards. And I felt like I was already collecting, right? Every month when I went into the comic book shop, I would get myself a booster pack or something of Magic cards. So they didn't need to make me do it, right? And if the expansion cards had just been different, without it being better, I probably would have bought some anyway because they were different and interesting, right? But because they were better, and keep in mind I wasn't even playing competitively, I was just competing with my friends. But because the expansion cards were better, and my deck would be weaker compared to those of my friends when we got together on the holidays to play Magic, I started to feel compelled to buy not just one or a few, but a lot of expansions to try and get the good cards that I would need to compete with my friends. Because, of course, of 100 new cards, there were only 3 or 4 that were actually powerful. And, it's random which cards you get in the packs and the decks. So the whole idea is just make you buy deck after deck after deck to try and get a Shivan Dragon or whatever it is that you're looking for, right? And so I became very frustrated with that and saw what they were doing, and I said, I am done with this game. Right? First I said, I'm just not buying any new cards, and then I just sort of said, I'm done with this game. And all of my friends kind of decided that at the same time, too, and we just stopped playing. This is like in 99 or 2000, I can't remember. We just stopped playing. After that, Wizards of the Coast purchased Dungeons & Dragons, right? And what the lesson they learned with Dungeons & Dragons is that players of Dungeons & Dragons are an awful lot like players of Magic the Gathering. They're always looking for that quote-unquote edge for their character. They're always looking for that improvement to their character, especially in 3rd edition where there was all this easy min-maxing ability. And so what they learned to do was keep putting out expansions and supplements for the game that included something that the players would like because it gave them an edge, right? Like a single awesome card in an expansion pack of Magic the Gathering. And this method has been continued by Wizards of the Coast today. And this is what they're doing in 5th edition. So in 5th edition, when they put out a book that is a GM book, like Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos, it's a campaign setting for GMs to run in Strixhaven. They include in the book a few pages at the beginning, 20 or 30 pages at the beginning, of player-oriented material. Even though this isn't a book players should be buying because it has spoilers for the campaign, right? What they have in it is a new race. And they make sure that the new race has some abilities or features that players are going to want and no other race has. So that if you don't buy Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos, you don't have access to that thing. Right? Especially electronically, like on D&D Beyond. You can't put it on your character sheet unless you or someone in your group has purchased and shared it with you, right? And so they added the owl creatures, the owlin, that have abilities maybe that synergize with certain classes. And then each class, all 12 or whatever of the character classes, rangers and paladins and druids, gets a unique Strixhaven-specific subclass. And these subclasses are also better and more interesting and have more features or cooler features or more powerful features than the ones you get in Player's Handbook, just like the expansion decks of Magic the Gathering, right? And although it's not necessarily competitive in D&D, like Magic, so you're not competing against the other players, players want the cool new stuff. They want the more powerful abilities. They want their character to get more powerful. That's why they like leveling up. And so every time they put out a book, they feel like they have to put out something that's an option that's better than all of the existing options. So when they put out the first couple of supplements, all they're trying to do is sort of give you options that beat the Player's Handbook. But now once Xanathar's and Tasha's are out, and they put out another book, well, now they're going to have to beat Xanathar's and Tasha's. And so this makes each new set of options for players, whether it's feats or subclasses or races, better than the existing options that were there before. Just like in Magic the Gathering, the new expansion set has to have cards in it that are better than any of the other cards in any of the other expansion sets that were there before, because that's what makes people buy the expansions, whether it's books or cards. Right? This is their operating philosophy. This is how they do it, and it's why they're doing it, and is absolutely what they're doing. Right? With all the other reasons about ancestry and species and all that, that's all smoke and mirrors. The purpose behind what they're doing is to sell books to as many people as possible. And the reason they think this will work, and the reason it does, is that players want more powerful options. And so they give it to them. Okay? And so this then is going to affect the campaign. Because as players keep getting more and more powerful options to use with their character, then whatever the DM is putting into the campaign at a given level becomes relatively easier and easier and easier to do, right? Just imagine somebody who's only bought a few starter decks of Magic the Gathering and has made himself a green and black deck that's pretty good against other starter decks, right? But all the other players have got 4 or 5 years worth of expansions every year they put out a new one with all of these amped up cards. The guy with the starter deck is going to lose every single match, right? Because the other players are going to have quantitatively better cards and many of them in their decks, right? And similarly, if the GM is the guy with the starter deck, right, and his monsters are the cards of the starter deck, and the players are playing with the expansion decks, i.e. the new classes and races, they're going to just mow down every encounter the GM made. It's going to be impossible. So that makes it extremely frustrating because you can't rely on anything you make up being challenging into the future because the next book might make it obsolete. And that can be very, very frustrating to any GM. But it also has a couple of other consequences that make the GM's job unpleasant because if it's just difficulty, if it's just challenge, a GM can deal with that, right? Instead of fighting goblins at level 1, you just fight bugbears. And if the level 1 characters are more powerful than they used to be, and they absolutely are, then you can still challenge them. If it's just challenge, that wouldn't be game-breaking. The problem is it is worse than that. Basic Expert reports, and I have no reason to doubt him, that he's getting this from another source. I'm not sure which source. Supposedly there are 42 playable character races if you include every single supplement in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons published by Wizards of the Coast. 42. Right? And each one of them has gotten more powerful and has more powerful options. So there are 42 races. 42. That is an awful lot of races. And most GMs who are going to world build are not going to have 42 races in their world, or they won't want to. But the players aren't picking races based on what fits into a world or a concept. They're picking races on what fits into this class and what's going to synergize. I want a tiefling, which is Player's Handbook. It's not a new race. I want a tiefling warlock because they're quantitatively better with all of their stats, right? Or a tiefling sorcerer, right? Or I want an elven blade singer wizard or an elven bard. Where did I read? Half elven bards are the best because of the way their stats work. So they're a really good race, and tiefling bards. And there are build guides. If you're gonna make like a Beastmaster Ranger, pick this race. If you're gonna make a Gloomstalker Ranger, pick this other race. They synergize, right? So the players are choosing their race based on build guides. Out of the 42 races, which one is the best for this? And that's what they pick, which has nothing to do with the world and is not conceptual. It's only statistical, right? The same thing is true with subclasses, with feats. Right? They're picking the feat that synergizes with the rest of their character, not the feat that works in my world or your world if you're the GM. And so players buy the book, they get access to the feat, and then because they paid for it, they're going to want to play it. But GM, I bought Strixhaven for $39.99, and I like the Silvery Barb spell, and I want an Owlin Sorcerer who can cast Silvery Barbs. Who are you to say I can't use it when I bought it with my own money? Now you're like making it a waste of my money if you don't let me play it. And Basic Expert didn't really actually focus on this, but I want to. This is poison. This is absolute poison. This is destructive to the player-game master relationship. All these people who never played first edition AD&D and Basic and Expert set. They never played it in the 70s and 80s. They're only hearing about those of us who played it, having come to 5th edition since Critical Role. They look back at first edition and they think it was adversarial. That GMs were out to wipe parties and kill player characters, and player characters and GMs hated each other and they were playing against each other. That is a lie. I never played in a game where the GM was trying to kill the party. People died, characters died, yes, but the GMs always felt terrible about it. And it wasn't just my group. Nobody would have played the game if it was GM versus player like that. It was always done in a friendly way. If it was competitive, it was friendly competition. It was not adversarial. But this has the potential to make it adversarial, right? Because now, as a game master, you're putting me in a position of either me being happy or the player being happy. If I'm trying to keep my world consistent and I don't want to use this race, but the player has bought the book and is demanding to use the race, now we have a problem, right? By putting all of these options in and having them be official options sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast and published by them, they're essentially endorsing these options for the players and putting the DM in the situation of having to say no. Rather than saying yes, the DM has to say no to the options, right? The DM has to say no to feats, has to say no to multi-classes. That's bad enough in the player's handbook, right? And we actually had somebody on the D&D Beyond forum. It was one of the last posts I responded to. And it was a young lady who was a new DM, and she was DMing for, I believe it was for some inexperienced and a few experienced players. And as a new GM, she had asked her players to accept the constraint, no feats and no multiclassing, and they bitched at her, and they complained at her, and they called her a bad DM because she wasn't letting them spec out their characters the way they wanted. And she came onto the forum and she said, "Am I a bad DM for doing this?" And a bunch of people were like, it's not hard, just let them have it. And I went on there and I said, no, you're not a bad DM. I think they're bad players because as a DM, you had said to them, as a favor to me, could you please restrict yourself from not using these options because I don't understand the game yet and I'm just trying to learn. Those guys are jerks. Don't play with them. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't think she answered that. I don't even know if she went back to the forum after that. But this is setting up an innate adversarial relationship between any GM who wants to ever limit anything and the players who want it all. And by putting 42 races out there, any GM that says you can only have 20 even 20 is a lot. Any GM says, oh, you only have 20 is a bad guy now. And the players are going to get mad. Same thing with all the subclasses. Same thing with all the feats. And now what they're doing in 1D&D is tying feats to backgrounds. So they made it so feats aren't optional anymore. And I think I may be wrong, but I think they even addressed this in the video. And their answer was, well, players really like feats, so we want to give it to them. And we want them to try them out, and then, they can see if they like them. What if the DM doesn't like them? What if he doesn't want to use them, or she doesn't want to use them, like this poor girl who was just trying to learn the damn game and didn't want the complexity of the feats? Wizards doesn't care, because they know they'll sell more books with all these feats. But this is inherently setting up an adversarial relationship between the players and the game master, because the game master now is the bad guy or the bad girl for restricting anything. And I saw this with my group. It was just one player, but my best friend wants all the options. So when he was trying to take silvery barbs and do this other crap from the books, and I'm like, no, we're not playing from any of the setting books. Strixhaven is a setting book. We're not in the setting of Strixhaven. But why can't I just have the spell? The spell doesn't have anything to do with the setting. I don't own the book. You're not using anything from a book I don't own. Well, I can share it with you. Why can't you just let me have this? It isn't fun for me. You're ruining my fun by not letting me have these options. Right? Now, he wasn't quite saying that. He just said, well, it's less fun for me, right? But that's the kind of conversation that you're in for now as a game master because you're limiting the players. So the DM is now put in a position of either limiting the game to what the DM is comfortable with and ruining it for the players, or letting the players do what they want and have these options and ruining the game for himself. That is not a nice choice to force people to make, and they shouldn't be forcing GMs to make it. Yes, other games have optional rules, and yes, other GMs have to limit those optional rules like Champions, but Champions has like 4 stop sign powers and a couple of advantages, limitations, and 1 power framework that has a stop sign on it that are the real optional stuff. In an entire book. It's not book after book after book after book. If you say Player's Handbook +1, which is the way Adventurers League does it, used to do it, I'm sure they're not going to eventually, you're only letting the players use like 10% of the options. It's only like maybe 12 playable races, and the other 30 playable races would be unacceptable. And I can't remember how many classes. The one guy that I know calculated it out and said if you do all the possible race and class combinations, it's like 1,400 combos, right? But if you are doing Player's Handbook plus Xanathar's Guide, say, only about 1,100, only about 200 or 300 of those combos are going to be possible, and the other 11 or 1,200 are going to vanish. So now you're taking the players and taking away 3/4 of their options, 90% of their options. So they're going to get mad. A lot of them aren't going to like it. So this is setting up an implicitly adversarial relationship between the dungeon master and the players. And it's happening because Wizards of the Coast is trying to sell books, not because there's an objectively good reason to have these races and classes in the game. It's all about selling books to the players and they don't care, right? The reason they make the options powerful is because the audience for sale of the source books that have adventures in them is not the dungeon master. It's the players. Because the players are 80, 90% of the audience, and they need to sell the books to everybody. So to get me and all of my other friends to buy Strixhaven, they're trying to put a race in there we're going to want to play. So that means it has to be a race that is cool and that people are going to want and has abilities that will make you better. And they're going to need classes with the subclasses that are better than the existing subclasses. And all of this is happening. So now you have dozens of subclasses, dozens of races, dozens of feats all entering your game from these books, or else you're the bad guy for banning them, right? And that's not what person who wants to DM, being a fundamentally giving person, which is what you have to be as a DM because you're trying to create a good world and you're just trying to make your players happy. What person would want to have to make that choice between their own fun and their players' fun and know that either I'm going to be miserable or the players are going to be miserable and can't both be happy? So then you say, well, why not just allow it all and be happy? Like, why? My best friend would say this. Why not just allow it all? It's fine. Why restrict it? Why ban these races? Why do that instead of, should we just go to a different contact now that we're level 25? I think we should. So why ban these 30 of these 42 races? Why not just have them all in your world? What's the big deal? They do it in the Forgotten Realms. I hate the Forgotten Realms. Do you know why? Because they have all 42 races in the damn Forgotten Realms. Or most of them. It's a Gonzo world. It's got everything in D&D in the Forgotten Realms because it is their showcase universe. And that makes it boring to me, flavorless to me, uninteresting. What do I need here? Let me look. Hang on. We get psionic defense here, so we're going to need that. But I think we want to do these first. I don't like Gonzo. I don't like Gonzo settings where everything is in the setting. I like more directed, more, what's the word for it? I go to Marvel White Trap. He usually got good story arcs. More sort of narrowly focused, constrained worlds are much more realistic and believable to me. And they're a lot more enjoyable for me to imagine. And it's one thing to play in a Gonzo world, which I'm kind of doing right now because I feel like the Critical Role world is very Gonzo. It has to be because Matt Mercer's world has to appeal to all the fans, and so it has to have everything in it. So it's got every little of everything. That's fine for them, but and it's fun to it's maybe fun to watch. I can play in it, although it's not my taste. I can play in it. However, I don't want to run it. Right, playing in it is once every 2 weeks for 3 hours. I can live with a Gonzo world once every 2 weeks for 3 hours, and as a player, most of the time ignore the Gonzo because it doesn't tend to come up that much inside of a session. And when it does, I can just stomach it. Okay. But as a GM, I'm living with the world 24/7 every day. I'm spending a little bit of time on crafting my world, on building something, on creating an NPC, on designing an encounter, on designing a dungeon, on designing a city, on naming the NPCs in the city, on figuring out some lore aspect of the world or something about the gods. So when I was running my Roman campaign for 2.5 years, I wasn't working on it 24/7, but in my spare time, 3 to 4 times a week, I was living in that world for several hours. Right? Probably adding up to a total of 10 to 12, 15 hours a week. Maybe more. Sometimes whole weekends. If it's Gonzo, I'm going to hate that. I'm not going to enjoy living in that world. I don't want to make that stuff up. And what's more, I'm not great at making that kind of stuff up. I'm much better at a more directed kind of a world. Consequently, I don't want to make up a Gonzo world. And I don't want to work on it week in and week out. But having 42 races of all kinds of weirdo, rabbit people and owl people and elephant people and rhino people and hippo people and turtle people, all in the same world with snake people and humans and elves and dwarves and halflings, it's cartoonish. It's Gonzo. And what Basic Expert was saying is, well, maybe the GM doesn't want a Gonzo world. If you say, I'm not allowing a Gonzo world, Did I not do this guy? What is going on here? I went to the wrong guy. I went to the automated contact. That is so annoying. That's probably one of the most annoying things of the interface. You come into a new zone and it gives you the contact that is not your mission. And that was, since I was going to a contact, because that's all this guy is, I didn't realize it was the wrong contact. Anyway, back to my rant. The GM is now forced to either accept a Gonzo reality as his world, or to ban a whole bunch of stuff and make the players unhappy. So it's not just about power level, right? And this is why I said all these options and all of the new books and stuff. Like what Wizards is doing is adversarial to GMs. This is what I meant when I said it allows the players to run rampant in the game master's world, right? You're forcing the game master to accept Gonzo into their world, whether they want it or not, or disappoint one or more of their players, which GMs, by our nature, are very unwilling to do, if at all possible. Talos. So let me give you a great example. Let's go all the way back, December of 2019 into January of 2020. Friend of mine at work had invited me to be in his D&D game with another person I knew from work, a couple of other people, and my best friend. And so we're all like starting to make up characters, and it's in the Forgotten Realms. And I was like, well, and he said, I don't love it, but he said I'm not gonna have time to make up homebrew. So what I found out later he was going to do was just run Descent into Avernus, which is set in the Forgotten Realms, and then he could just run it. Right, and he wouldn't have to make anything up, and it would be easier for him. And I can appreciate that, and I don't mind. And as a player, I don't mind the Gonzo setting of Forgotten Realms. But I also got the sense, because this guy was very busy, that his campaign was going to end probably long before we finished Descent into Avernus. And I estimated that by the summer, and we're doing this because you have to clear these missions or they'll just keep giving it to you and they won't give you a story arc until you do it. So we're going to have to do it. I estimated that by the summer of 2020, he probably wouldn't be running and I would need to probably take over. And I thought, well, I'm not going to take over his adventure and I'm not going to run in the Forgotten Realms because it's Gonzo and I hate Gonzo. It's also high magic and I don't like high magic. So, and before anybody says FR is not high magic, it's high magic. So anyway, I began thinking about what kind of a world I would run, and this is where I came up as one of the options with my Rome game. I came up with two. A 4th edition style Points of Light campaign, which would be set in a more lower magic world and be sort of like a Conan sword and sorcery type world, or Rome, which by its very nature, because of Rome, was going to be very similar to the real world, with a few D&D races. I was initially thinking just a few, and a very understated level of magic, and a lot more sort of Roman Empire type stuff. This is my original conceptualization. During the course of us getting prepared, and this one presumed DM not really doing anything, my best friend began messaging me about, are we ever going to start? Are we ever going to do anything? Several start dates have been proposed, and then nothing had happened. And he said, I'm really worried we're not going to be playing any D&D, and he was excited to play D&D. He hadn't played it in years. He was watching Critical Role. He didn't have any paid DMing games yet. And so he was very, very excited about it, and he was getting frustrated that we weren't starting. And I finally said to him, don't worry if this guy doesn't pan out, if his thing doesn't pan out. I'm toying with some campaign ideas. And he said, well, what would they be? And so I gave him the pitch for the Age of Chaos, as I called it, which was the Nantir Vale analog that I came up with from 4th edition, and Rome. And he was interested in both, and he asked questions, and I was just in the process of typing. Believe it or not, guys, this is just like one of these moments that whichever one I do, I would like sort of a low fantasy, low sorcery, low magic world. And just as I was like in the process of getting ready to type that, I don't think the characters had gone into the screen yet, but my hands were on the keyboard getting ready to figure out how to word it. He said, well, as long as it's not low magic, I don't like low magic. And I was like, well, bleep, right? Because now as a DM, I realize that what I would enjoy, he's saying he wouldn't like. And now I'm left with this incredibly unenvious choice of setting up a campaign that I would like or setting up a campaign that he would like. But I'm not going to be able to do both. And when I realized that, I got to tell you, I was pretty unhappy. Because I wanted to make him happy. I wanted to please him. I'm making sure there are no engineers here. And then we'll nail a captain. We might have to run from this. Don't know. They're all blue, so we might be alright. We'll take a luck. So, what did I do? I created a medium high, not super high, not quite the Forgotten Realms, but I created a medium magic and a medium Gonzo world. I added more races than I was planning. And I made magic more prevalent than I absolutely ever would have wanted to. I made it basically a normal D&D world. Not quite Forgotten Realms level, but with a lot more of the classic D&D stuff in it than I had ever intended when I conceptualized the campaign in Rome. Because my feeling, if I had been talking about this ahead of time, would have been, what's the point of having a mostly normal D&D game in Rome? We may as well just play in the Forgotten Realms. The point of going to Rome is to do Roman stuff. And the reality is, one of my disappointments in that campaign is we really didn't do a lot of Roman stuff. And we didn't because conversations with my best friend convinced me that he, at least, wouldn't enjoy that. So I sacrificed my own pleasure in this campaign for him. Now, I am not saying that gives me props. What I'm saying is this is what DMs do. But it's not fun as a game master to realize that you're going to have to choose between you having fun and your player having fun. And what D&D is doing, what Wizards of the Coast is doing with all of these options in all of the published books, is doing that to any GM who doesn't want a Gonzo, Eberron / Forgotten Realms world. Any GM who wants a tighter, narrower, more realistic, medieval authentic kind of a world and is trying to run 5th edition is going to have to make that choice between letting the players have the Gonzo and letting the DM have his narrow, focused, desired world. And given that world building is such a pleasure for so many of us, I think a lot of DMs have a problem with this. And this is why I have said I will not run 5th edition anymore. Because I know that at a minimum, it will set me up in conflict with my best friend, who absolutely positively will not hear of a low magic, low fantasy world. It is not his taste. And I'm not criticizing that. We all have our own tastes, right? But in, say, a regular game like, I don't know, AD&D, I don't have to make that choice because there are only 5 or 6 playable races, and they're the standard ones. By rules as written, you can't play an Owlin or a Dragonborn in AD&D. There are only a few classes, and some of what we call classes now were subclasses like Paladins, Rangers, and Druids, and Illusionists. And the abilities that you got were prescribed at each level. There weren't any feats. The spells were pretty restricted. The spell list was pretty small of what you could do. And so, as a consequence, I could play a low magic world pretty easily in AD&D, and rules as written at least, he doesn't have a leg to stand on to argue with me, right? He'd have to be arguing that I let homebrew into my world, not that I simply use an endorsed Wizards of the Coast product. Owlin are not homebrew. Harengon are not homebrew. Tortles are not homebrew in 5th edition, but they would be in AD&D, and I could simply say no homebrew. Now, he'd still be unhappy, right? But there's a whole different level of argument that goes on between the DM and the players, and a whole different level of obligation a DM feels that they're under when you're talking about officially sanctioned rules versus homebrew. It's pretty well understand that DMs are not required to allow third-party homebrew in their games, and that you're really doing a big, what my department chair would say, I don't normally speak this way, but it's a big ask to be asking for somebody else's homebrew that was posted on the internet to be allowed in your game. But it's not a big ask to allow to have the published materials be in your game, because those are presumed to be balanced, even though they're not, and they're official, right? And so not only are you giving all these abilities to the players, right, but you're also like endorsing these abilities by making them be official. Wow, these guys are all lieutenants. I didn't realize that. We might have to run from this. Let's placate one and confuse one. So this is the problem, and this is what I mean by what Wizards of the Coast is doing, being player-friendly and DM adversarial, right? Bad for DMs and good for players, or something players will like and makes the DM's life harder. And this is what I meant by players being able to, what I said was run rampant in the DM's world, right? You're forcing a Gonzo world on the DM, right? And you've got the backing of Wizards of the Coast to do it. It's not just your personal opinion. They said this is okay. Why isn't the GM allowing this thing from Mystic Odysseys of Theros, even though we're not playing in the world of Theros? Or from the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, even though we're not playing in Ravnica? Or from the Spelljammer books, even though we're not playing in the Astral Plane? Right? I mean, one of my best friend, right after Spelljammer came out, he's playing in some game, and he's playing an Astral Elf, and he's playing whatever, some class that came out in Spelljammer. And I said to him, "Oh, cool. Are you guys playing in Spelljammer and like Astral Plane, Spelljammer?" "Oh, no, they're playing in regular Forgotten Realms." That's just the character he chose. So he's now taking a thing from a setting book, and even though he's not playing in the setting, he's using it. And the GM, presumably, I mean, maybe the GM didn't care, maybe the GM likes Gonzo, but it's also possible that the GM felt obligated to allow him to do this because it's in a published book. And so this is an actual problem, because it's setting up an adversarial relationship between GMs and players over what's allowed in the game. And as I said, and I think I stand by this statement, it allows the player to run rampant in the GM's world. We're not going to finish this whole spawn. This is the end of the mission, and we will head out. And, you know, to a lower degree than what I'm describing, I kind of let my best friend run rampant in my world, because not letting him do it would have made him unhappy. So I let him run a little rampant in my world. He made up his own homebrew subclass because he didn't like any of the subclasses that were existing. Now there were so many options, he probably would have picked one for sorcerer. I never dared say you can't use feats, because I knew he wanted feats right from the beginning. I had a higher magic world than I wanted, because I knew he would be miserable if it was a low magic world. He told me he would. He didn't want to play in it. He might have quit, right? But if he hadn't quit, he certainly would have been a lot he would have been much unhappier, right? I added things like Aarakocra and Centaurs as playable races and Goliaths to my world, even though I didn't want them, because I recognized that I was gonna try to ban some of them, right? But I couldn't ban them all because players will be unhappy. So on the Gonzo scale, I wanted my world on a scale of 1 to 10 to be like a 2. It wasn't a 10 like Eberron, or a 9 like the Forgotten Realms, but it was like a 5 instead of a 2, right? And when it came to all the optional stuff, again, I wanted a 2 or a 3. It wasn't a 10, but it was like a 5. So I had to have a much more option-open, Gonzo-y world than I wanted to keep at least one of my players happy. And again, not every GM is going to feel that way, but any GM who does is going to want nothing to do with 5th edition at this point. And that's why I think so many good GMs like Coleville and Luke Hart and some of the others are throwing up their hands and walking away, at least partly, because all of these GMs have really strong, powerful, well-designed worlds. Colville's is amazing. I wish he would put out like a big giant book of his whole setting and everything in it, because it's awesome. His history is really cool. The way his race relations work in his world, like the dwarves are slavers, and there's a whole reason why they're slavers. I remember him in his 4th edition game. He was describing the dwarves are slavers because they got into a battle with some NPC dwarves. None of the players were dwarves. And the dwarves are slavers, but he said they're slavers because each nation, each species, race, whatever, in his world had to make a bargain with Ajax the Invincible, who's like the evil overlord of this world, to avoid being, attacked by him. And do you have any missions here? Well, can't use that. So I guess we're going to somebody else. So what? Laura Bernetti. She's new. I'm trying to go to the new context because they'll be level 25, and we need to also go to Alice Park and raise our challenge rating here, our difficulty. Anyway, he said the dwarves had to make a deal. Everybody had to make a deal, and the dwarves' deal was we'll give you slaves. And so dwarven like raiding bands walk the roads and stuff, and if you get caught alone, they'll just grab you and turn you into slaves. And so a lot of people hate dwarves, but he said there are also a large number of dwarves who hate the fact that their Thane made this deal, and they will fight their own people because they don't like this, right? So you don't know when you meet a dwarf. It's not always possible to know if you're meeting the ones that don't like what their Thane did, or if you're meeting the ones that do. And so, anyway, his world is really, really cool. But because his world is really cool, he can't maintain that and still have all 42 races playable in his world. You cannot maintain that kind of really cool verisimilitude because it's just too insane. It's not believable. It's cartoon land. It's Gonzo. And like some people love Gonzo settings, and Dungeon Crawl Classics, as I understand it, is a Gonzo game, and a lot of people love Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's fine if that's what you like, but if you're not trying to build that kind of a world, this can be world breaking for you, and it can be campaign breaking for a GM who simply does not enjoy that kind of a setting. You can't expect a GM to run a setting they hate. I would never be able to run the Forgotten Realms. I hate it. Hate. Worse for Eberron. I can't run in those worlds. I don't like them. Right? So now you're setting it up so that as a GM, I either have to make a crappy world that I hate and live in it, or I have to disappoint all my players and tell them they can't have the fun they want to have with the races they want to have. And that's why I said these new supplements are helping players, are allowing players to run rampant in the GM's world. And it's making GMs not want to run, right? Because it basically forced me, I didn't have a Gonzo world, but it forced me to have a world that was more Gonzo and higher magic than I wanted. Because to do otherwise would have required me to ban everything after Player's Handbook. And my players weren't going to like it, in particular my best friend. Right? And it was putting me in a position of either I get to have fun or they get to have fun. But we can't both have fun. And that's not a really enviable position to be in as a game master. It's not fun to feel that way. And that, guys, is why I've said I'm not running 5th edition ever again. Because I don't want to feel that way. So, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to GM my best friend. I've been hoping someday maybe to get my group to play some Savage Worlds. But if I ran in a fantasy world for Savage Worlds, I would want it to be low magic and, just a couple of races and none of this Gonzo stuff. And now Savage Worlds doesn't have all the options that D&D has. They don't do the game that way, but they have a lot of them, and I would still probably ban some. And my best friend would probably say, this isn't any fun for me, I don't want to play. I think if he actually does GM, which I highly question whether he will permanently, he and I can continue to play together as long as he GMs or somebody else GMs. I think the next time I take over the reins, he's going to quit. because he's going to say what you're proposing to do isn't any fun for me. He likes high magic Gonzo stuff. I don't know if he would say it that way, but it's pretty clear to me that he does, right? And when he talks about what he likes doing and how the characters that he makes up, they're Gonzo characters, right? They're not in this understated, realistic type of vein. They're in the superhero, crazy, barely fits into the world kind of thing, right? And as a result, that's clearly what he likes. And so I think our tastes have changed, right? It's funny because when we were kids, he liked the understated stuff and didn't like the cartoony Gonzo stuff. But now he seems to have liked, and I liked the Gonzo stuff more, right? And now we've totally switched, and I can't stand the Gonzo stuff, and he seems to love it. And that may mean that I can't run for him anymore. But I have gone through the 2 years of running a campaign that I don't really like as much as I could because I felt forced to run more than what I wanted, more Gonzo than I wanted, more options than I wanted to make my players happy. I'm not doing that again, right? We're going to have a session 0 conversation, and I'm going to have to say, guys, I don't like Gonzo worlds, and I don't like kitchen sink settings. I won't do it. It's going to be very restrictive. If you can't have fun that way, I can't be your GM. I'm not going through another 2.5 years of having a world that doesn't really satisfy me because I had to compromise on too many things to make some of my players happy. It's not that I don't want to make the players happy, but I need to be happy as a GM with my world. I need to be excited about my world. I need to want to live in my world on a long-term basis because that's what you're doing as a GM. You're living in that world day in and day out on a long-term basis. And as players, you're just coming in here to play once every couple of weeks. But as a GM, I have to live with it. And if I'm living with something that I'm not truly happy with, it dampens my enthusiasm. There's a reason why the Rome game ended 7 levels early. And yes, one of the reasons is, well, several reasons. One of the main reasons is the high level play, right? That I struggled with that. But the number one reason is that I wasn't fully happy with my world. And I recognized that to make myself fully happy with it, I would have had to do things that were going to make my players unhappy. And once the world was in motion, I couldn't really rip all that stuff out. Right? I made the world as Gonzo as I thought I could stomach, and no more than that. And after I ran it for a couple of years, a year or so, I realized it's more Gonzo than I would like. And now it's too late to rip it out of there without, completely ruining verisimilitude, and it'll break the hearts of some of my players if I do that, so I can't do it. And it made me not want to keep running. It made me say, I want to start a new campaign where I just lay down the law at the beginning. It's not Gonzo, it's not high magic, it's low magic, realistic, and like it or lump it, right? And I feel like now, because I've done the GMing duties for 2 years plus 2.5 years, I'm no longer obligated to do it, right? The way I was when we started. I agreed to do it. One of the other people offered to GM, and I said, no, I'll do it because I had a world ready and I was excited. And I did it, and then I felt obligated to bring it to a conclusion. But I'm no longer obligated. I've done my duty now. So anything I do now is like extracurricular. It's extra. It's above and beyond the call of duty, if you want to call it that, right? And so given that, I feel like I can be a little bit more insistent that this is going to have to be a way that I like, or I'm not going to do it. Someone else can do it. Now, if nobody else can run, then they have a choice, right? You either accept my extremely idiosyncratic and highly restrictive world that will make me happy to create, or we don't play. And I don't like ultimatum like that. I don't like doing that. But unfortunately, having experienced it the other way, I don't see an alternative for myself because I won't be happy enough to keep running it. Same thing with the different game system, right? I'm also going to say it's got to be Savage Worlds or Call of Cthulhu or something else. I'm not touching 5th edition with a 10-foot pole. And the reason is that 5th edition, of course, already has this momentum, this entropy, if you will. It's already further down the entropic path of Gonzo, right? The 5th edition, all the rules together in 5th edition are high magic, high Gonzo, super high, 10 out of 10, right? So The default starting point of D&D is Magic level 10, Gonzo level 10. Whereas the default starting position of, say, Savage Pathfinder is maybe a 7 or a 6. And in regular Savage Worlds is like a 3. So they're not 1s. I don't know that I necessarily want a 1, but I don't want 10. And I don't want to go over like 5. It's a lot easier to reign Pathfinder for Savage Worlds from 7 down to 5 than a 10 down to 5 from 5th edition D&D, right? And so this is why I won't run 5th edition, because I'm gonna pick a system that's already starting lower and on the crazy scale of Gonzo and options and races and everything, right? I mean, Savage Pathfinder has like 8 races, not 42. So it's easier to restrict 1 or 2 of those races and just have 6 races than to try and restrict 36 races so you can have 6 races, right? So, so I think we're going to have an issue, right? Because my best friend wants to do 5th edition and he wants to do high magic, high Gonzo. And I don't want to do either of those things. And I don't know if it's possible to please both him and me. And I'm done pleasing him at the expense of me. I did it for a lot. He doesn't think I did it, right? He thinks I lowered the boom a lot and I didn't let him do all the things he wanted to do. But I let him do an awful lot more than I wanted to let him do, right? So let's say he asked me for 20 things and I gave him like 11 of them. So he's annoyed that I didn't give him 9, but like I didn't want to give him any of them. I didn't want to let him play his homebrew class, but I knew he would be unhappy if I didn't. And I didn't want it to be a high magic world, but I knew he'd be unhappy with a low magic world, so I made it a medium magic world. And I didn't want to have a high Gonzo world, but I knew he'd be unhappy with a very human world, which is what I wanted to do, right? Rome was all human, and I was just going to make a bunch of human races, and then elves and dwarves and halflings, and that was all the world was going to be. And he thinks that's boring. So he was like, no, you should have a lot of races. So I did it for him. I didn't like it as much as I would have the way I originally did it. So, yeah, I'm sure he would say that I said no a lot. But the reality is I said yes way more than I wanted to. And it was to keep him happy. I didn't do that as much with the other players, a few times, right? They didn't put me in that position as often. Either because they liked what I was doing or didn't have any ideas different from what I was doing. I don't know. If I had gone like really gritty and not Gonzo-y, I don't know, like if it had been an all-human world and if it had been, very low magic, I don't know if the rest of them would have liked it, right? I just know my best friend wouldn't, so I changed it and didn't do that at all. And they liked whatever I turned out, right? I think they enjoyed what I turned out, but it was not what I wanted, right? It was a compromise between what I actually wanted and what my best friend and the other players, but mostly my best friend, wanted. And I don't know if he realizes how much of it was a compromise, since he likes what he was asking me to do, and probably... What are we still looking for? Oh, defeat Regalian. Where is he? His taste is what he asked me to do, so the more of it I did, the happier he was, and I don't think it would have occurred to him that what I was doing I didn't really like. I just don't. Like, he wasn't trying to be a jerk. Okay? He just thinks the high magic Gonzo way is cool, and the low magic medieval authentic way is boring, and assumes that everybody else thinks that too, and, can't see how you could possibly like an all-human world. Like, he complained because our current Critical Role game, he's the only non-human. His character is a gnome, and all the rest of us made up humans. And he was like, oh, that's so boring. I didn't answer him, right? I don't want to get in an argument with him, but I was happy that we were all humans because I like that better, right? I like human default with 1 or 2 characters of a different species, right? But I like a human-centric world. It's interesting, Lord of the Rings is Hobbit-centric. I don't mind that because hobbits are basically short humans. But all of the characters in Lord of the Rings are mostly human with slight tweaks. They're not crazy, weird, insane, strange-o races like you get in D&D, like owls and aarakocras and things like that. Now, look, the cleric player who played the Aarakocra was awesome, and he's a great role player, and I enjoyed his role playing of that character, and I don't regret having Aarakocra. But the world didn't turn out the way I'm not talking about the campaign, right? I'm not talking about the idea of like whether they succeeded or failed on their missions and stuff and plot points. That's not what I'm talking about. But the world itself didn't really turn out the way I wanted it to as a world building exercise because there were some things that, I just had to compromise on to make my players happy. And what I'm saying is the more of these options and the more of these uh, books that come out, the more DMs have to admit into their world be to keep their players happy, and the crazier and more gonzo and out of control it gets. And it's going to make any GM like me, or probably Matt Colville or Luke Hart or any of the others who have good, strong world building capabilities, unhappy because we want a coherent world. And having all of these races and classes and subclasses and all these options destroys the coherency. Right? It's chaos. And I think entropy is the right way to describe it. It's increasing the amount of entropy in your world every time a new book comes out. Every time a new book comes out, you play if you play Mythic with the GM emulator, there's a fate chart and there's a chaos factor, right? And the higher the chaos factor is, the higher the probability that crazy randomness happens in the game. And what D&D is doing is every time they release a book, they raise the chaos factor. Highest chaos factor you could have, I think, is 9, right? And what D&D has essentially done is jack the chaos factor of D&D from like a 1 when it first came out up to like 9. And so now you're in Gonzo land. And any GM who tries to take it out of there and bring the chaos factor back down is basically stuck. Stuck like we are in a mission where I can't find the last guy I have to kill. So I will keep looking around here, guys, but I'm not going to make you watch me because that's boring. I think that's enough for today. I hope I've made my point. I think I have. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server.